The idea of the universal caliphate, or the Caliphate of Man, is not only a theory of the sovereignty of the Ummah as a body over its rulers and political institutions, although it is that, but also of the restriction of the Ummah's authority to whatever God has delegated and commanded. The sum of the covenant of vicegerency, from the constitutional standpoint, is the supremacy of God's law over any other authority, but through the consultative activities of the people. The covenant of vicegerency can thus be summarized as the Sharia of God and consultation of the people, or text and consultation, reason and revelation, constraint and freedom. This is the problem that remains to be untangled. How are all of these various materials woven together? And what contradictions and ambiguities are produced by this attempt to do justice to the divine sovereignty, the rule of law, popular sovereignty of some kind, representation, expertise, and the residual authority of ordinary believers to speak and act as God's caliphs? I believe the best way to do this is to proceed carefully through the distinctly divine and distinctly popular elements of this theory of legitimacy and sovereignty. For though divine and popular sovereignty are formed from the same relationship, their elements remain conceptually distinct and are often in tension.
Welcome to Middle East Centre Book Talk, the Oxford podcast on new books about the Middle East. These are some of the books written by our members, or books that our community are talking about. My name is Usaama al-Azami and I teach contemporary Islamic studies. My guest today is Andrew March, a scholar who is no stranger to Oxford. He completed his DPhil at Oxford's Department of Politics and International Relations as a Marshall Scholar over a decade ago. After graduating, Andrew taught for 10 years in the Political Science Department at Yale University and has taught Islamic law at Yale and NYU law schools. His book, Islam and Liberal Citizenship, The Search for an Overlapping Consensus, published by Oxford University Press in 2009, is an exploration of the Islamic juridical discourse on the rights, loyalties and obligations of Muslim minorities in liberal polities, and won the 2009 Award for Excellence in the Study of Religion from the American Academy of Religion. Andrew's second book, the subject of today's podcast, is The Caliphate of Man, Popular Sovereignty in Modern Islamic Thought, published by Harvard University Press in 2019. As we will see, it examines the problem of divine and popular sovereignty in modern Islamic thought through to the Arab uprisings. Andrew, welcome to Book Talk.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm delighted to be here spiritually in Oxford, and I'm very, very grateful for your interest in my book.
And thank you for joining us. I mean, this is one of the more positive aspects, and we need to take as many positives as we can over the sort of current crisis, that we can actually host people from different parts of the world. And so it's wonderful. It would be wonderful to have you in Oxford, but it's wonderful to have you beam in, so to speak, from Massachusetts. So tell us something about the writing of your book. When did you start? What sources did you use, and where did it take you in terms of travel?
Well, the origins of the book are around 2010, 2011. I had finished my first book, and I was interested in a number of different things in Islamic thought and Islamic law at that time, some of which related to extensions of the themes that I had written in my first book. So I was interested in how to explore in greater depth some of the harder questions related to the encounter between liberal ethics and Islamic ethics, right? So some of the really hard questions related to the scope and the limits of religious freedom, freedom of expression. These are the core areas where liberal conceptions of autonomy or freedom of religion clash with Islamic conceptions of a belief and a conception of the good, the truth of a particular metaphysical tradition, and limits on the scope for human behavior to do certain kinds of harms at the communal level to religious goods or the freedom for a religious community to thrive. So I was interested in this. I was looking at certain modern and classical theories of the objectives of Islamic law, or maqasid al-sharia. So I was poking around in these kinds of areas. I had written a few papers exploring this on whether this particular Islamic legal theory of the maqasid was a fruitful area for not resolving, but structuring ways of thinking about how Islamic aims can and might not be able to be advanced in non-Islamic political communities and legal settings. So then you had the Arab Spring, and I was actually going to be giving a paper in Tunisia in the wake of the Arab Spring. So I was interested in the thought of Rashid al-Ghannouchi, who I had been interested in for a while, who figured sort of had a kind of minor appearance in my first book. But I was familiar with his 1993 treatise, Public Freedoms in the Islamic State. So I opened this and I was going to say, what do Ghannouchi's views on Islamic law, Islamic legal theory, the application of Islamic law in a modern state say about the prospects for lawmaking in a future non-authoritarian democratic Tunisia? So the broad question was, what is his conception of Sharia? What is his conception of the balance between classical fiqh and maslaha or consultation or something like this? And as I worked my way through his book, I realized these themes absolutely figure, and they end up becoming somewhat important for the arguments of the Caliphate of Man. But what I realized is the real action is this theory of the universal caliphate, or the Aqd al-Istikhlaf. This is what appeared more than anything else in his book. This is what he himself described as the pillar or the foundation of Islamic political philosophy. The idea that the people, both individually and collectively, have been deputized as God's vicegerent on earth. So this kind of hit me over the head. I realized that's where the action is. And it's a really, really fruitful and complex area to look. Now, obviously, I was not the first person to discover this. So part of it was to go back and realize, what is the secondary literature on this theme? What other kinds of questions does it open up? But that was the kind of impulse. It was sort of one of these moments where I said, that's it. That's my next book, right? The problem of sovereignty as it brings in everything that, of course, you're taught as a first-year student, that Islamism is this commitment to hakimiyya or divine sovereignty. But then here's this robust commitment to what they are calling popular sovereignty. And so just a flurry of questions raised themselves, and I was kind of off to the races after that.
Okay, fantastic. So that gives a really useful sort of overview of where, in a sense, the book came from. And of course, this Ghannouchi is the only figure who gets two chapters to himself, so to speak, rather than just the one which someone like Qutb and Maududi and some of the other figures, Rashid Rida, even Abdul Razak al-Sanhuri, these figures get not as much attention, shall we say, as Ghannouchi. And I think the background that you've given, the fact that he figured, and I recall him sort of having a presence in your initial book, in your first book, but that you happen to be in Tunisia, and in a sense, Tunisia is the only case within the Arab revolutions where there seems to have been something, however shaky, still sort of coming out of that's going in the sort of direction that one would hope that it would go. So thank you for that background. And if I can sort of move on to my next question, it's that your book takes us on this journey that attempts to trace the genealogy, as you highlighted, of the important concept of sovereignty. Or popular sovereignty, more specifically, in modern Islamic thought. So what you've described in the title of your book is the Caliphate of Man. And you say that this has kind of become the defining idea within contemporary Islamism. In broad strokes, could you perhaps offer us an outline of the genealogy that you present to, in a sense, give us an idea of the overall argument of your book?
Pertaining to the idea of the universal caliphate, or in general about the...
In a sense, as I see it, your sort of book is about the development of this idea of the universal caliphate translating into an Islamic conception of popular sovereignty. And so, I hope that's a reasonable reading of the book. But how sort of the notion of the Caliphate of Man becomes this ideal, as you put it. It travels through certain scholars. It isn't present, for example, in Rida, but it is by the time we get to Ghanouchi, the, as you put it, central idea.
Right. So I begin sort of in the present with an observation, right? That I actually opened the book with Yusuf al-Qaradawi's sermon in Tahrir 10 days after the revolution or something like that. Right. And it's not a work of political theory, but you see these themes in which popular agency and popular virtue, democratic political action, along with divine will or divine intent or the divine plan, are kind of fused together. So you have this idea that that the voice of the people is the voice of God, and yet at the same time you have this fundamental observation that it's not just any old people, right? It's a virtuous people, it's a pious people, it's a religious people. Right. So this is the first sort of point of departure and point of comparison with lots of non-Islamic democratic theory, which says that begin with a people, whether it's an arbitrarily defined group that has been, sort of set off geographically or ethnically or because of some development of a national consciousness, and then you ask, how can that people be free or self-governed or legitimately governed? But you're really asking about how any people could be.
Right.
Whereas in the Islamic conception, the people already has a particular quality or attribute, but more importantly, the people already has a certain will. It has a certain defined objective for itself. Right. And that's an important distinction, because in a lot of Western democratic theory, the point of democracy is to discover the people's will, or to discover which popular will is legitimate or can be realized through law or coercive action. That's the point of deliberation or procedure or whatever it is. Right. Whereas in Islam, the will is already given in advance. So that is itself a kind of complicated question, right? How can you have a legitimate commitment to democracy where certain aspects of the people's essence, identity, and will are already given by the theory? So the people can't choose to be other than what it already is, which is the ummah. Okay. Right. So that's the beginning set of questions. So then, historically, there was a question of, well, where does this come from? Right. What is the significance of this? How does this actually represent a kind of revolution over pre-modern Islamic thought? So there's a number of themes, right? One is which pre-modern Islamic thought is kind of predicated on, if you're talking about the mainstream Sunni juridical tradition, on a kind of condominium of authority between sulta on the one hand and ilm on the other. So in some form or another, whether it's the sultan or the khalifa individually, or sulta as an entire governing apparatus, and the scholars collaborate in the governing of the community. And we have a understanding of the traditional way that is that is divided between the sultan leaving many matters to the traditional Sharia courts versus having a wide latitude for governance through siesta courts or through other kinds of non-shari modes of or non-fiqhi modes of governance. Okay,
and these are outlined in chapter 2 for those who are interested. Yes,
and that's not meant to be a super original observation. It's meant to be kind of schematically summarizing things that are widely observed in literature. Although this, again, I want to stress that that's kind of the Sunni juridical story about things. If you actually read a lot of history of Ottoman political thought, we know that in reality, Ottoman political thought in particular is much more influenced by Sufi conceptions and philosophical conceptions that centralize and prioritize the ethical character of the ruler, right? They're a lot more ruler-centered, caliph-centered, charismatic than the classical Sunni juridical model wants you to think, right? So, we'll leave that aside for now.
Yeah.
So one major theme is how does the traditional condominium of authority, the guardianship of the sultan or the caliph, whatever the executive is called, and the scholars become devolved to some kind of popular political community. And then the other story is how does a fairly non-utopian, realistic conception of politics in the Sunni juridical tradition become transformed to a much more ambitious, much more utopian aspiration for politics in much of modern Sunni thought. So that's the kind of background. And then I moved through a number of thinkers to make connections.
Just to add a point, you actually nicely sort of illustrate this concept, Arosian idea, I think taken from his political liberalism, of the realistic utopia. And so you when you're saying it's utopian, it's not that it's, it takes people as they are to a certain extent as well. Yeah,
that's my idea. So sometimes people hear me saying that it's utopian, and in the kind of popular folk sense of the word utopian, we use that to mean unrealistic, pie in the sky. It's a criticism, right? Which itself is an interesting observation, right? That we, a kind of very, very accessible history of this relates to perhaps Cold War liberalism, Isaiah Berlin, the idea that utopianism per se is the problem because it goes against the grain of human nature, it requires too much coercion. And so part of the Cold War liberal brief against totalitarianism was a brief against utopianism as such. And then, of course, you have the kind of period after communism in which there's this assumption that markets and liberal democracy can more or less provide for the needs of people. And this is also a non-utopian story because we're not meant to be prescribing a particular final end for individuals that holds for everybody, but rather creating the space for people to pursue different sorts of ends. Now, whereas I, on the other hand, don't use utopian as a criticism. It's just a mode of thinking about politics. It's a mode of thinking about what is the best that we could hope for in ideal circumstances. And then you add to that a certain kinds of feasibility or plausibility constraints that result in a kind of aspiration for a realistic utopia, given the kinds of beings that we are, given the limits of our moral capacity, the limits of our selflessness, or the limits of our ability to act on perfect moral virtue, what then is the best that we could hope for if we designed institutions in a certain way? So that's what I mean by a certain kind of utopianism. But what I mean more specifically in the Islamic context, and here I'm very, very open actually to being corrected on this, but on my reading, a kind of developed Sunni juridical model of politics doesn't see the political sphere as where human beings realize their good or their virtue or their path to salvation. Now, arguably, in early Islam, the emphasis on following the right caliph, following the right vehicle of salvation did see politics in this way. Again, arguably, some of these Sufi and Falsafa-inspired theories in which the ruler is the font of virtue and salvation, and it kind of flows down or emanates down to the people. Arguably, that also makes politics central to the realization of our good and our salvation. But so much of classical Sunni political thought is very, very realistic. It's about removing the greatest harms of social life: violence, fitna, sedition, hunger, crusaders, bandits, all of this. And what and what's
very minimal.
I avoided using the word minimal on purpose because I don't think it's minimal, but I think it's constrained. And then also, if you look at somebody like Ibn Khaldun, who, as we know, is widely influential later on in Ottoman political thought, it's not minimal, but it's a very constrained conception of what politics can bring.
Right.
And even where somebody like Ibn Khaldun will say the difference between rational royal authority, mulk aqli, and the caliphate is that the caliphate brings a benefit in this world and in the next. He doesn't really explain why is it that the caliphate is bringing maslahah in the next world. It's kind of just asserted.
Right.
But just to close out this thought, what he thinks any government can do by way of bringing about justice or peace or the good functioning of economies and so forth, that's all that the caliphal model of governance can do. So it's not that the caliphal model of governance brings about some a greater heaven on earth. It just is in some way it provides benefits in the actual heaven. So that's the first thought. The second thought is what then becomes remarkable, and again, feel free to disagree, is how much in thinkers like Maududi and Qutb and others, the political world, in the sense of bringing about Islamic law, is a site for moral perfection, realizing our good, in addition to just removing injustice and trying to bring about basic justice. So that's also part of what I mean by the utopian vision. Politics becomes a site for moral perfection in ways that I don't think is the norm in pre-modern Sunni thought.
I think I broadly, to be honest, I mean, and this will be somewhat impressionistic. I've not gone out and set out to answer this in my own research, but I broadly think that your sort of intuitions are, correct in this, and you kind of, you cite Ufaymah Anjum in your notes to kind of give something which actually reinforces your point, which is to say Ibn Taymiyyah tried to move away from this ruler-centered vision to a community-centered vision. But the fact that Ufaymah, who's a mutual friend of us, of course, says this is an illustration of the fact that wasn't really the case. I think, to answer your second point, which is why is the caliphate, so central? Why is it better? Ibn Khaldun doesn't really give a response. He just says, it gives you salvation in the next life as well as in this world. You're getting sort of political, benefits and justice, as it were. And my thoughts go back to Ghazali and his Iqtisad, al-Iqtisad fil i'tiqad, where he makes a very stark statement, which I'm not sure is necessarily representative of how all Sunnis saw it, but saying that without the caliphate, nothing we do is in a sense legitimated.
Legal, but in the literal sense, it's not right. You need the caliph to authorize judges, and the law, right? So he's the condition of possibility for legality,
right.
But it's not. But it's not that. Therefore, that the site of moral development is elsewhere, right? It's Sufism, or it's in.
But you read someone like Ghazali's book on the Ihya, and so many of the books are actually chapters in law, right? I mean, it's about how do you take the minimal bar that fiqh is interested in, and raise that engagement with the fiqh to a point of ihsan, so to speak. And I mean, my suspicion, and again, you can feel free to correct me if I'm wrong on this as well, and I think we're both in a sense exploring a question which is really profound and not necessarily straightforward. My suspicion is that the conditions of modernity, you suddenly allow for, and you look at people like Qutb and people like Maududi and who they're citing, very often it's Quran and Hadith, it's the earliest period, the earliest history. It allows for bypassing the classical sort of like crystallized form of what Sunnism was, and tries to go back to certain ideals where actually politics was a space for very serious contestation about salvation almost. So I do think that there does seem to be some of that happening there. I think these are tendencies that are latent or made more latent, if that's a way to put it, in the classical Sunni tradition. But they're ever present because they're in the Turath, they're in the Quran. The Hadiths are in, we think, I had a recent discussion with Omar Anshasi, who you may know about this. Through much of classical Sunnism, Hadiths almost seem a bit marginal. You think of Ghazali's Ihya and the extent to which it's criticized in the modern period for having weak Hadiths. But my remark to Omar was, well, people blame Ghazali a little unfairly. If you look at any books of fiqh, you can see they're not terribly interested in Hadith, unless you're like the Hanbalis, who are the tiniest school anyway. So, I think this rediscovery, to refer to Ahmed Shamsi, who I sort of interviewed a couple of days ago actually on his book, this rediscovery of the Turath, of these classics, does dramatically reshape the way in which we see the possibilities of the tradition, I think. And that's what allows people like Maududi and Qutb to appear with, in some respects, novelties. In other respects, rereadings of things which are latent in the tradition, so to speak.
Yeah, I don't want to say too much about that. I'll leave the specific comment about the centrality of the Hadith to experts. I will say that,
right.
When you read Maududi and Qutb on the early period, it's not scholarly, right? It's not about, particularly in Qutb, it's about, first of all, there's an emotional aspect. It's motivating for action. It's mythical, right? Again, a word that's often used in a negative connotation, right? That it's merely myth as opposed to fact. But I mean it more that it's creating meaning.
Right.
And in many ways, it's simplifying things, right? It's meant to smooth out things. Not to explore it as a space of contestation, but a space of deriving certain kinds of lessons for action. And I don't know if this is a good comparison or not, but I'll raise it. It's a little, perhaps it's a little bit like the way that Machiavelli is going to read Livy, or perhaps the American founders want to read the classical tradition. It's not as classicists or as scholars. They're trying to derive lessons and conclusions, and that often involves smoothing out a lot of things, right? So Machiavelli wants to explore what are the conditions for liberty in a republic, and so he reads, Livy in particular, and some of the most well-known lessons are the ways in which, like, popular violence is a good thing for popular riots and so forth, because this is the language of the poor against the grandi. Now, whether that's not a scholarly observation, it's an observation.
It's pragmatic in a sense. It's a utilitarian reading almost.
And it's an intervention in contemporary debates about how much should we fear the poor, and are these sorts of things going to lead to an expansion of liberty or not? Similarly, for Qutb, it's not a very sophisticated reading, but it's a very sort of ingenious reading in a way. And my reading of Qutb on the early period, which again is only partial, it doesn't encapsulate everything, but it's sort of like saying, if you get the politics right, you get everything else right. Okay? Get the leadership right, get the law right, have righteous governance, and then lo and behold, look how infused everybody is with zeal and virtue and desire to protect Islam and desire to help their brother. That's the kind of lesson that I think Qutb is trying to show, is that the early Sahaba, they were so virtuous and so pious because the politics was right. Anyway, that's my reading. It's admittedly, it's not, it doesn't cover everything that he has to say about this period, but for me it's a very distinctive contribution, and it's part of what answers the question, what is political about political Islam? Right? How are they giving a particular political reading of Islam? It's not just that they're emphasizing the importance of politics, or emphasizing divine sovereignty, or engaging in takfir if you don't implement Sharia. They have a theory of what politics does. And that's what I found particularly interesting.
And I mean, let me sort of perhaps... in a sense, I've got certain questions that are lined up, but I find sort of much of your commentary so intriguing. It goes in so many interesting directions. I want to perhaps contest this notion, not necessarily contest it, but the way in which the term scholarly, the work that the term scholarly is done in thinking about someone like Qutb, you're saying, look, this isn't a scholarly sort of like piece, in the same way that Machiavelli isn't engaged in a cataloguing of the various ways in which someone like Livy is referring to ideas that are used by later peoples as means of justifying liberty of some kind, and so on. But rather, there's a sort of, he's trying to get something out of that text. And for Qutb, something quite practical, something quite social, something, as you say, quite political. And to a certain extent, I think a lot of Islamic scholars through history, their motivations are going to be very different to, quite dramatically different to what a modern scholar would consider to be a scholarly engagement. There are the great sort of encyclopedists and the people who are cataloguing things and also sort of maybe engaging in original reflection, someone like Jahid and so on, in his Kitab al-Hayawan. But you think of someone like, again, Ghazali writing in the Ihya, there's an urgency to the practicality of what he's writing about. And you read something like Kitab, Dhikr al-Maut, and it's supposed to shock your system, so to speak. And I think that spirit is carried forward by people like Qutb in a very different way, because for Ghazali, the political realm is, Mawardi's kind of solved it in some level. He's also made his contributions, Ghazali, in the way that Kroner talks about that, they're just there to be the muscle power that keeps everything going. But the ulama and the sharia are basically, as long as they're in power, this is how Noah Feldman also presents it, as long as they're in control, that's all good, right? But that's not the case with Qutb and Maududi and these people. Suddenly everything's been unseated. Suddenly it's all, everything's up for grabs in a scary way, I think, for these people. And that's the situation they're reacting to. And they're thinking, well, what are we to do? Our societies are basically becoming hyper-secularized in their imagination. And our sort of values are being usurped and destroyed. And people are being taken in by this sort of liberalism in the form that it existed at that time, by the conception of the nation state as the true seat of sovereignty and popular sovereignty. Obviously, people like Maududi were very exercised by those sorts of concepts, as well as Qutb in his own way. So I think there are interesting things going on. That's just a reflection. I don't know if you'd like to add something to that. I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts on that. If you think perhaps I've
No, I think we're on the same page on that issue, yeah.
So I wanted to sort of press on to, this is really a fascinating discussion, to be honest, and I have, a lot of questions. I'm going to go on to in a sense, because we're discussing Maududi and Qutb, which I believe chapter 4 and 5 in your book, I'm going to actually circle back to chapter 2 for a moment, where I think, in a sense, you provide this compendious overview of what might be called normative pre-modern Sunni, the normative pre-modern Sunni conception of sovereignty. Of course, you also highlight that this is, in a sense, the received normative pre-modern Sunni conception of sovereignty. This is how Sunnis look back at their own tradition today and read it in the pre-modern tradition. So there are all sorts of other possibilities, as you've suggested. So in subsequent chapters, you explore how modern Islamism radically reformulates this pre-modern conception in order to generate the Islamist notion of popular sovereignty that underlies Islamic democratic theory. And you, in several instances, use the term invention to characterize this introduction of popular sovereignty. I think there's another Yale scholar, I was just sort of having a breeze through Uwaymir Anjum's comment on your book, and he cites, someone also speaks about the invention of popular sovereignty.
Edmund Morgan is the famous historian.
Right.
Who talked about the invention of democracy, invention of popular sovereignty and Puritan thought, or the invention of the people in American Puritan thought, yeah.
And I wonder if you can maybe give listeners a sense of just how radical a transformation you consider this to be from the pre-modern to the modern conception.
Well, what I try to argue is that, like many inventions, it's based on certain kinds of materials. So when modern Islamic constitutional thinkers or democratic theorists talk about things like the importance of the bay'ah, or the idea of the khilafah or the imamah as a contract, or the idea that the people, the ummah, is actually the agency behind this. or the idea of consultation, shura. These are materials that exist in the pre-modern tradition for sure, and this is partially what Awamir's book is also trying to do with Ibn Taymiyyah, is to say that there's also a tradition in pre-modern, pre-modern Islamic thought that wants to ground the important aspects of leadership and law and virtue in the community as opposed to the caliphate. So these materials are there, and they're meaningful. And of course, I think it's also fair to point out that there's both an apologetic motive to say, we don't believe in the divine right of kings, we're not authoritarian, we never believed in absolutism. And there's also somewhat of a sectarian motive, which is to say, we're not Shia. We never believed in divine designation. We never believed that God chose the ruler. For us, the ruler was always just somebody that was appointed by the community. Or again, when you read Mawardi, and you see that one of the ways in which the ruler comes to authority is through ikhtiyar, which is tempting to translate as election, but it's not, selection or choice or something like that.
It's within the semantic range of the term election, so to speak.
That's right.
But yes.
So these materials are there. It's just, as we know, historically, even in the most democratic moments, perhaps the election of Uthman or something like this, it was 6 people deliberating, and it wasn't because they were representatives of the community, it's because they were the power brokers who might end up fighting amongst themselves. So shura as the election of the ruler was a way of was a mode of conflict resolution, not about empowering the ummah to choose its own rulers. So anyway, so I'm certainly unaware of any serious reflection on the idea that the ummah is the source of political authority or has to participate for governance to be legitimate. So that's one way in which these democratic commitments rely on materials that are there, but
they mean something else.
The other thing is this trope of what's meant in the Quranic verses that talk about God appointing a caliph on earth, that this is what God means is the entire ummah, and that it's a political designation, and that it's a transference of God's political authority to the people at large. That's a complete invention. And so one of the things I point out. So
can you say that once more? Forgive me. I sort of.
So the trope of the universal caliphate, The idea the ummah is God's caliph, what I refer to as the Caliphate of Man. That this rests on certain Quranic verses, most famously, chapter 2, verse 30, amongst many others. The idea that this, unambiguously, without discussion, without the need to go through traditional tafsir, means that it's the ummah at large, or the people at large, has been deputized by God as his deputy, and that this is a political designation. It's the transference of his authority to then control the political apparatus. That's a complete invention. So
that's
even when Ridda writes or compiles the articles that went into his book al-Khilafah or al-Imam al-Uzma, he has as an epigraph 230, but he doesn't mean that this is because the ummah chooses its caliph, or it means that you have to appoint a caliph. It really refers to the office of the caliphate as occupied by a single individual with the classical shurut: male, Muslim, free, reason, all of the different virtues and qualifications, etc., etc. Now, you do have a tradition in which human beings are God's caliph. You have this in akhlaq literature, you have this in Sufi literature, you have this in falsafa literature, but it's not really a collective political authorization for it. It's about how we become morally perfect. When we perfect ourselves morally, again, whether that's understood the way that Sufis do, or the philosophers do, or Sunni moralists do, you can aspire to being God's deputy on earth,
Right.
At an individual level,
Yeah.
by becoming, the best that you can be, so to speak.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
And in certain kinds of theories, it's part of this tripartite theological anthropology, right? What is
Right.
the human function, following Aristotle's
Right.
argument in the Ethics?
Right.
And
The
our
rational, the
function-
irascible, yeah. And, right.
No. That our
No.
function is to be not our ethics, but
Okay.
the Aristotle, the argument from the ergon, right? The function.
Okay.
And so Islamic ethicists do the same thing. So what is our function as human beings? To worship God,
Right.
to imarat al-ard, right? To civilize or populate
Right.
and develop
Right.
the earth, and
Right.
to be God's caliph. That's what it means to be human.
Right.
But it doesn't mean that human
not
beings
political.
collectively
Yeah.
have this political sovereignty. So
Right.
anyway, so that the idea that becomes the central idea of Islamic political thought is, rightly or wrongly, a major revolution.
Right. So, Andrew, thank you so much for covering a broad range of topics. And for those of you who are still here, we're going to continue our conversation, Andrew and myself, on a number of points that have arisen in the course of this discussion. And I'm going to actually, if it's all right with yourself, Andrew, sort of pick on one of the, in a sense, one of the questions that I found, where I've, in a sense, disagreed with you, or disagreed with your reading. And I think this is going to be quite interesting, because hopefully what will happen is, I'll be able to understand perhaps how I've misunderstood where you're coming from. And hopefully I'll be able to share with you my own thoughts about why I think in a particular way about this question. So you conclude your work with the suggestion that for a number of reasons it does not seem possible to reconcile divine sovereignty and popular sovereignty, and that Islamic political thought may choose to discard sovereignty as a central idea in the next phase of its development. If you can indulge me for a moment, I wonder if you feel that an Islamic conception of popular sovereignty may legitimately be developed that is at odds with prevailing Western conceptions of popular sovereignty. In other words, must concepts adhere to their European genealogies to be authentic, or can they be developed independently in other traditions to express, for instance, the rejection of authoritarian government, while simultaneously upholding an Islamic vision of divine sovereignty? And if I can just briefly add to that, in a sense, I'm not suggesting, I don't think you ever say that, Muslims can't develop their own sorts of ideas. What you're saying is, they end up being inconsistent with other ideas that they claim to uphold. And I wonder if that inconsistency is a perception of, what democracy means, for example, within the West, or what sovereignty means within sort of the liberal tradition. And you're saying, no, it's not. It's actually something more.
I don't think that's what I did at all. I think, in fact, what I did is treat them entirely in their own terms.
Right.
So my entire point is that there was this attempt to create a conception of sovereignty, a conception of democracy, a conception of legitimacy that was on their own telling, entirely in their own terms. But what I'm saying is, in their own terms, they were trying to do two things. Say, God is the original sovereign, God is the original legislator, human beings do not have the freedom to legislate for themselves in defiance of what God has revealed.
Right.
And yet, God has not appointed anyone between himself and the ummah to bring this law into reality and to adjudicate its various modes of realization in the real world.
Right.
Therefore, the people can be sovereign because the people, A, is authorized by God with bringing about this law into reality, but also because the people is already united around its desire and its will to bring this about.
Right.
So the only thing that I think that I'm smuggling in is this semantic idea that the language of sovereignty is the language of unity and univocality. So God can be sovereign because God is an entity that can speak in his own voice in a definitive way. A king can be sovereign because a king is a physical, natural being that can give commands in his own voice that have finality.
Right.
Now, are nations, peoples, ummas, the kinds of entities that can be sovereign?
Right.
If so, that requires a certain assumption about
Univocality.
univocality, unity,
Right.
definitiveness, finality.
Right.
Now, what is it that allows you to even imagine that?
Right.
So we asked that question about Rousseau. We asked that question about other theorists of popular sovereignty.
Right.
And so it's fair to ask that question about Islamic democratic theorists like Ghanouchi.
Yeah.
And all you have to point out, even as these theories aspire to toleration, a certain kind of political pluralism, there's always this assumption
Right.
that the people can only be God's vicegerent
Right.
if it sees itself as God's vicegerent and not some other kind of political entity. So
Right.
that's, I don't even want to say it's a paradox.
Right.
I just want to say it's a dilemma
Right.
that is built on certain kinds of metaphysical and sociological assumptions about the world.
Right. And I wonder.
And so I
Yeah.
really want to push back at the idea
Sure.
that I'm holding them account to a Western theory of democracy or a Western theory of sovereignty. I really don't think I am. Now,
Sure.
I may, because of my own ways of seeing the world, exaggerate how much pluralism there is.
Right.
Or exaggerate the importance of moral pluralism. That
Right.
would be the place, I think, to push back and say, well,
Right.
except for Tunisia and Turkey
Right.
and places
Right.
that have been
Right.
subject to coercive secularism,
Right,
you
right.
know, Muslim societies may be a lot more
Sure.
unified on
Sure,
religion
sure, sure.
and morality than other
Right.
places. That would be a place where,
Right.
where I would be open to
Right.
sort of being proved wrong. But
Right, right.
I don't think conceptually I'm doing anything other than taking these theories in their own terms.
So what I would say to that, and I really appreciate the opportunity really to be able to talk to the author about their book. It's, I think, going to be a very edifying conversation for myself especially. But what I would say is that in a sense, I think this dilemma really arises with Ghanouchi, right? The other theorists, democracy isn't really very high on their agendas. That sort of popular empowerment of the populace, in a sense, to the point of being legislators, isn't quite as present in the way that, as you put it in the sort of preface, Ghanouchi is the most important theorist of the harmony of Islam and democracy. And this is one of the things that I found striking in his 2012 book, Demokratiya wa Huquq al-Insan fil Islam, is that he literally uses democracy and shura as synonyms, which a lot of theorists are very loath to do. And I think, with other theorists, whether it's someone like Muhammad Imar, whether it's someone like Yusuf Qaradawi, whether it's someone like Muhammad al-Hassan al-Dadu, who doesn't write but he speaks a lot, what I notice is they'll always make very clear, that الشعب لديه صلاحيات of تشريع, so to speak. So the people have legislative prerogatives. ما لم يحل حلالا ويحرم حراما. There's a very clear red line. As long as they don't make.
She says the same thing.
Right.
Yeah.
And so once you say that, you're giving them what Maududi called basically limited popular sovereignty under the suzerainty of God.
Who is there to say when the people has legislated in a way that violates the halal and the haram?
Right.
Who
right.
does that?
Right. And you
No,
talk
answer that
about
question.
you talk about epistocratic authority. So in a sense you have
Okay, good. So you have epistocrats.
You
have the scholars.
You have the ulama. Yeah.
Where do they get their political authority today?
Right.
No, answer.
And in a sense what I'm suggesting.
No, I'm asking you.
Yeah. No, I mean, like, in what capacity are you asking me?
In your
in my theory.
posing those thinkers back to me.
Right. I suspect there will be a number of options, but in a sense, one of the things that you highlight is that, in a place like Pakistan, when they have set up a council, I forget what it's called. Well,
the Sharia.
The Federal Sharia Court, the FSC. I think 5 out of the 8 were not even ulama, right? Okay.
Correct. So let me just answer my own question. The point is that even everybody, the whole point is that the people is not radically free to legislate. That's why it's an Islamic democratic theory and not Rousseau.
Right.
But the question, but that's rhetoric.
How so?
It's rhetoric to say the people can't violate the divine law.
Right.
How do you know when they have violated divine law? Who gets to pronounce on
Right.
Who gets to establish?
But that's a problem that's existed throughout Islamic history, right?
Yes, but never before were you saying that the people is the one. You say the scholars or the rulers. And then that's the point of chapter 2 of my book. Is that you have this embryonic clash between the scholars and the rulers that is more often than not not really allowed to develop, right?
Sure.
Or you have Semi Ayyub's recent book on the Ottoman and late Hanafism, which says, well, the Sultan actually had a lot more authority within Hanafi fiqh than we previously understood. Not just that he has his own siyasa. So what I'm trying to say is, of course, everybody's going to say that the people's right to legislate is limited, but then you have to look at what they do with that idea. What institutions are established to litigate that or adjudicate it, and where do they get their authority? Even Ghannouchi will say in his previous work, of course you create some body of scholars, but they only derive their authority from the people's appointment.
Right.
All right, go on.
And in a sense, what I'm saying is that, the reason someone like Ghannouchi is emphasizing they're getting their authority, it's a contextual thing which I'm sure you're aware of, the fact that he doesn't want these bodies to be appointed by authoritarians. A lot of this discourse is counter-authoritarian, and so in reaction to that, I think that contingency doesn't, the contingencies of Ghannouchi's thought are mentioned in your sort of piece, but I think that they could be more central in the sense that, yes, he's saying the people are given that authority as a way to bypass that sort of authoritarianism of the modern nation state, or of modern state.
That a little bit. So yes, that's the obvious context, but that's all that Islamism has always been that, right? So why in Maududi and in Qutb and in others is the Ummah given this centrality in restoring Islam to the world, whether it's through jihad or through popular political action or through the forming of parties? It's because the rulers are the problem. So Islamism has always been a kind of populist movement. Okay? So it's not just that Ghannouchi is the first to think, well, I don't want bin Ali to be appointing these judges. That's always been part of the problem. Now, of course, we know that Islamism has also been utilized by authoritarian rulers and collaborated, state Islamism. So I'm not trying to say that Islamism has always been a populist or an anti-authoritarian movement. Far from it, right? In fact, quite the opposite. The second there's a chance of co-optation by a virtuous king or something like this, you'll take whatever you can get.
It's a pragmatic sort of ideology, so to speak.
Yeah, but the other problem is, so the other point is that all of these things are part of the buffet. So there are some, like one of the things I argue about Maududi is that his thumb or his hand is still on the scale of epistocracy.
The I think all of these people are.
Yeah, the people is in there, but like the scholars have not only the right but the obligation to take on a lot of this authority. So that just kind of creeps in. So when you have this tradition of...
I don't think it creeps in. I think for all of these people, that's going to be something which, I think it seems like it creeps in because of...
I mean, the people creeps in.
No, that's what I'm saying. I think it seems like it creeps in. The people seem to creep in because of, the dominant Western conception of what, popular sovereignty should be. But that's what I'm saying, that in the Islamic conception of sovereignty, and they're trying to adapt a term which is used widely and they want to be intelligible to people, yes, it's going to cause these kinds of misunderstandings. They're going to say, no, this isn't proper popular sovereignty. You're not giving the people absolute legislative authority. And they're trying to say, this is my argument, in hopefully a forthcoming article, kind of about Maududi, that, no, I am using this in this term to garner some intelligibility with you, But to say that, no, that might be your concept initially, but I've taken it and I've adapted it in a way that you might not recognize as coherent, but this is entirely legitimate and quite coherent in our own context. Yes, these sorts of challenges exist with respect to the application of this, and you kind of were saying, okay, so what's it going to be? Like, what's the institutional mechanism and so on? I mean, I'm if you indulge me for a moment, and I hope that we can stay in touch on this point, because I'm kind of working on a project on this. I think the US government, for example, or the popular sovereignty in the US, I mean, in representative democracy in general, has elements of epistocracy. I mean, there's this great debate of Jimmy Waldron and Bruce Ackerman bring with respect to judicial review, right? For me, judicial review is basically epistocracy of a certain kind. For me, just to map on for purposes of comparison, the sacred document here is the Constitution. The ulama of the Constitution, the fuqaha, so to speak, are the Supreme Court. And you have various branches of government, and that's one mechanism that has been developed. And I think historically, Muslims have developed all sorts of mechanisms of this kind to deal with really the almost infinite possibilities of the textual sources and the early history. And Mawdudi and Qutb represent an effort to try and see, okay, how might that work in our own time in a way that doesn't sort of lend itself to the authoritarianism of the modern state, which was a major concern, obviously, in the era. I wonder what you think of that reading. Yeah.
So, of course, there's epistocracy everywhere, right? And so, but I would say the American context from the Western context, Supreme Court, of course, is one example, but it's much more common to look at the vast areas of bureaucratic and administrative domination.
Right.
So how much control does even Congress have?
Or the president, for that matter, right?
What's that?
Or the president, for that matter. The executive is so limited domestically that this is why he can't do very much about it.
I mean, maybe, but the idea is that there's so much that we just assume is a matter of expertise, right? Whether it's how to deal with a pandemic or the military or the economy or the stock market or... Right. I mean, so we're governed by expert authorities in all kinds of areas. So now that's the crisis. That's one dimension of the crisis of the modern Western idea of democracy.
Right.
In addition to concerns about oligarchy and all of that, which are obviously true, and which somebody like Maududi himself talks about, right? Why do you want this Western democracy? They don't have it. They're governed by oligarchy,
financial interests, and
but not entirely separate from that, but conceptually distinct is the idea that how could the people ever rule in these vast, complex societies in which you have permanent administrative or bureaucratic epistocrats. Okay, so then you have. How do you split that difference? Well, congressional oversight, or they can be removed, or you can set policy directives that they then implement. But that's I think much vaster area in which the language of epistocracy is used, right? That there are true answers, there's true knowledge, and we don't care about Joe Schmo's opinion on masks, right? Just put on your damn mask, because that's what the science says. Okay. So in the Islamic context, well, first of all, it has to be remembered that Maududi himself does not use the language of sovereignty about the people. So that's me saying.
Yes. He says limited popular sovereignty.
When you. Or suzerain, right? So limited authority under the sovereignty of God. Right. So he's much more explicit that he will not use. He will not refer to the people as sovereign. So that's a little bit of my own interpretive work saying, fine, but when you start to call the people the Khalifa, and when you remove intermediate authorities, and you ascribe to the Khalifa all kinds of political agency, let's see where this goes, and let's see what this implies. Now, in somebody like Maududi, he will still say that the people has an obligation to listen to the scholars. The scholars have an obligation to codify fiqh, to create these new codes, and then that's more or less binding. But then there's still cracks, that I outline in my chapter 4, right? When the scholars don't agree, or when it's a matter of indeterminacy or maslaha, there are these cracks in which popular agency starts to enter in ways that didn't really exist before.
Yes.
Now,
And
okay.
no, I mean, and in a sense, what I would add there is, Maududi is confronting a situation which is unprecedented, naturally, in Islamic history. The post-colonial, what Homaire Iqtidar calls the liberal colonial state, has established certain structures and mechanisms and bureaucracies, etc. And now he's having to actually answer questions that never occurred to the pre-modern tradition in many respects. In some respects, they did, but the state was such a small, you kind of signal this, the discussions about the state are actually the discussions about the imama, right? It's the imamate. It's just the office of the caliphate. And there's assumptions that, yes, he's going to appoint various people, etc. There's going to be a kind of bureaucracy. But it's not anywhere near as elaborated as the modern sort of behemoth that we live with. And so my sort of in a sense, complaint, in a sense, and this is not just directed at your sort of reading of Maududi, but generally a lot of the readings about modern scholars is, they're sort of radically transforming or reformulating the classical tradition. And I'm like, yeah, sure, of course they are. They have to if they want to be relevant and Islamic in any way, shape or form. So why is that something which is, why should that break be anything that surprises us a great deal? I think we can start off by saying, well, and again, I don't think you ever question his right to do these sorts of things, but well, obviously they're going to do that. They have to, if Islam is to be relevant, in the modern world, they will have to radically adapt. And here's how they're doing it, and how well are they doing it? Yes, there are all these aporias that are coming up. How unusual is that? If you look at the classical tradition, in a sense, do you see similar aporias? And I would suspect yes, there'd be all sorts of aporias that exist because these are human endeavors by default. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'm not surprised that they're doing it. It's just there are many ways of doing it. So So if you have, so let's just take the argument of Wa'il Halaq about the modern state, which is an ontological argument. It's not really a historical argument. That the state is ontologically incompatible with what the Sharia is, and the Sharia is Islam. Now, so Halaq dehistoricizes what he wants to make historical, and he ontologizes what is actually historical, right? So what is actually not Islam as such, but is the way that Islam developed from the 800s or the 8th century to whatever. He wants to turn into a metaphysical reality, such that
ideal. A metaphysical ideal that everyone has to adhere to in order to be Islam. This is what it has to be.
Islam is the Sharia, and the Sharia is the organic relationship of the scholars to text, to metaphysics, and the people separate from the state. Now, in addition to being ahistorical, it also, insofar as it's historical, takes something that is merely historical and turns it into Islam as such. Now, so it's a theological argument masquerading as an ethical historical argument. So now, that's not my point. The point is, fine. The state is bad for classical fiqh. It changes things. Nobody's going to say that a committee drafting a code is the same thing as scholars debating fiqh, in a madrasa in Damascus in the 1500s. But so what? That's for Muslims to work out whether they still think it realizes some kinds of core purposes. So, so I don't take the argument that just because they're trying to develop Islamic law through state institutions that is therefore inauthentic. My point is to say they're not just doing that. They are also trying to create a theory whereby a modern state could be not just minimally legitimate, because that's very easy within Sunnism, get rid of fitna, create order, create the conditions for a flourishing economy.
I mean, it's not just legitimate. One of the things you point out is the fact that it's an obligation. You mentioned, I think, in the chapter on Rida possibly, that they couldn't even, all they could say was we have an absolute obligation to establish the Khilafah, but they didn't know how to do it. in a sense, they're sort of resting on this historical obligation that exists. So, in a sense, there's this imperative.
In fact, this actually relates to an earlier question that you asked, which is, it's not just that they want to go back to the early Sahaba or the period after the Prophet, but they self-consciously almost want to delegitimize, for political purposes, so much of what happened in the meanwhile. So Ridda and others go so far as to say the Ottoman Empire was never legitimate because it was never granted legitimacy through a freely given consensus of the Ahlul Hal wal Aqd to create it. Now, that is a really historical, anachronistic argument, because no Sunni jurist before that ever thought that the ruler actually had to come to power through that kind of consensual, legalistic means, right? So there's something very, very remarkable.
Or they didn't require it. I mean, there are people who say, it's nice, but certainly it wasn't a requirement, right? Since Mawardi at the very least,
And so this is part of this, why I begin the story here, is because there is something about the fact that not only did they recognize that we, the scholars assembled in Cairo, don't have the physical shauka, the force to appoint a caliph, but without our consent, we don't want a Napoleon or a Salah ad-Din or an Ertugrul to come through here and establish everything. We want it to be legal. We want the Islamic imamah to be law all the way down. And that's a really fascinating moment. So they knew in principle how to bring it about. They just recognized that that's not the way things actually happen, and they were uncomfortable with that paradox.
So I mean that's and in a sense we've got a number of threads here, but I think the Rida point is interesting, because what's happening at that point, I suspect if someone like Amir Abdul Qadir came out of the desert and conquered Cairo and established a khilafah, Rida would be willing to accept that, because Amir Abdul Qadir would probably take him under his wing and the other ulama locally.
I think Qurashi descent.
That's a question as well. Of course, during the Ottoman period and possibly before that. But I'm thinking Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, who dies in, I want to say, 1552, but I might be off by a century. So it's within the Ottoman sort of Mamluks under the Ottomans. During that period, someone like Ibn Hajar is basically saying, yes, you can have, if you cannot find someone who is a Qurashi, you can have someone else. But even before him, Baqillani talks about, this is something which is not absolutely necessary, and that's centuries earlier. So there's enough latitude within the tradition to create those sorts of alternatives. The Ottomans, as Ahmed Shamsi talks about in his recent book, they tried to censor some of the early Ash'ari works because they actually, the Qurashiyya condition is very strong, and that's the dominant tendency within the whole Sunni tradition. Now, as a consequence of that, what I'm suggesting here is that Rida taking that sort of stance also probably has a historical dimension to it, which is, who have the Egyptians dealt with for the previous sort of century and a half? Muhammad Ali, his children, and then the Khedive under the suzerainty of the Ottomans, but then really under the control of the British. They've never had anything resembling, I think, a proper Islamic experience in recent centuries. And he's kind of reacting to that, saying, no, we have to choose who it is, because otherwise we're just going to have another Mehmet Pasha, so to speak. We don't want that again. So I also sort of wonder to what extent you signal this, but you kind of say that someone like Rashid Ghannouchi, after the Arab after writing in 2014, 2015, he basically throws his old theory out the window, as far as I'm concerned, or as far as I can tell, based on what I've read from you, which is to say that we're no longer Islamists, we're Muslim Democrats, and ultimately it's really, popular sovereignty is a real thing, and it really does take control. And my theory here, and it's very difficult for someone like Rashid Ghannouchi, who's currently the Speaker of the House, and he's just survived a no confidence vote, to actually speak his mind. And he's constantly conscious of the dynamic within, and to a certain extent it's not just fake it until you make it, but fake it till you become it as well. So I'm not suggesting that he's being disingenuous and saying one thing and not believing in it, but I do think the constraints in which these actors are operating really can bring into question, and I can recognize that for a Western scholar to say this about sort of a Middle Eastern scholar can be very problematic, and I don't mean to say in any sort of Orientalist fashion, but I don't want to dismiss it out of hand that he's perhaps not the most representative thinker when it comes to thinking about the possibilities in the long term. In this moment, yes, the Islamist project looks very untenable since at least 2013, and you mentioned also 2014 with ISIS. But I think that there are so many sort of unexpected occurrences in history, and we'll just have to hold our breath to a certain extent. I guess my entire approach is a very different approach to your very rigorous analytical philosophical analysis. I think I'm very much conscious of the and as you are, just it's a difference of emphasis of the historical contingency of tradition, meaning not just right now what Islamists are coming up with, but what Muslims have always come up with. There's a significant amount of contingency, and it's always an effort. I'm speaking for a moment as a Muslim here, of trying to, فَاتَّقُوا اللَّهَ مَا اسْتَطَعْتُمْ, or do what you can, right? And
right.
So
if what you're saying is a more commonsensical Sunni position would be to say you begin with reality, which is not always entirely of your own making, if at all.
Yeah.
You focus on the greatest harms and evils of political life,
right,
which are civil war, fitna, bloodshed, disorder, and then all the things that go on, destruction of properties, destruction of honor, all of that. You minimize those, and then within that, you try to make things more just, more pious,
right,
and more amenable to human thriving. So that's the default kind of Sunni position. Now,
yes,
how does that not end up in support the Wali al-Amr, whoever he is, don't rebel against Assad, even in Syria.
Yes. We saw that. Hamza Yusuf said that, right?
That's
So,
right. Now,
yes,
we don't like it when he says that.
Yeah.
Now, but
it's there. It's in the
are
tradition.
you saying that, that is, I mean...
What I'm saying is somewhat different, which is to say that, and I like Khalid Abul Fadl's book, and I was recently having a conversation about with Omar and Shasi about what Sunnism is, and he used this nice term, cacophony, that all of these possibilities are present within the Sunni tradition, and it's about hashing them out. I consider someone like Maududi and even someone like Qutb with his more extreme readings. I mean, Qutb's not the first, and he will not be the last to engage in pretty intense takfir, right? But all of these people, for me, are part of it. To use Jonathan Berkey's term, the formation of Islam, right? There's an ongoing formation taking place, and so for me, it's like, yes, Hamza Yusuf can come up, and right now the authoritarians are politically ascendant. That's true, but there are all sorts of alternative possibilities. If you'll forgive the self-plug, I have a book coming out in June, Islam and the Arab Revolutions, and in chapter 9 of it, I kind of try to push back against Khalid Abul Fadl's reading of Imam Ghazali. Not Khalid Abul Fadl, Muhammad Fadl, his reading of Ghazali.
To somewhat different individuals.
Yes, very, very different, of course. So, and temporally, of course, 1,000 years apart. But Muhammad Fadl basically says, well, the Sunni tradition, and same with Ibrahim Musa and a couple of other people, the Sunni tradition legitimates what happened in Egypt and what's going on with the UAE, etc. And for me, it's like, actually, that's flattening the Sunni tradition. You read Khalid Abul Fadl and you see the diversity within the Sunni tradition. It took some time to work itself.
Are we talking about Khalid Abul Fadl or Muhammad Fadl?
So Muhammad Fadl, in his article on the authoritarian temptation, talks about the Ghazali representing kind of the Sunni aesthetic that is reflective of Ali Gomara's behavior in the present. But I'm saying that if you look at someone like Khalid Abul Fadl on the question of rebellion, you can't flatten Sunnism on the question of rebellion. It's not possible. Yes, you have sort of a crystallization of a certain position that emerges in a certain context. But in the absence of that context, why would that ruling apply, right? I mean, we're not anywhere like that context in the present.
So that's my response
Yeah.
to the so-called neo-traditionalists,
Yeah.
for lack of
Yeah.
a better term,
Yeah.
that say this classical doctrine of obedience to the Wali al-Amr
Right.
unproblematically. I mean, this is your stuff, right? The stuff on Ali Gum'a and all that
Yes.
kind of stuff, right?
Right.
So the people that just say, Sisi is the Wali al-Amr, or the government in Abu Dhabi is the Wali. Now, that obvious, and then using that as as people like to say today, weaponizing that against what they call Islamists or Ikhwanis who want to
Right.
democratize things. Yes,
Right.
that's a great argument to say, well,
Right.
you think without argument you can just say that Sisi is the Wali al-Amr like some Mamluk Sultan?
Right.
Come on. Like, that's ridiculous.
Right.
So I absolutely agree with that. But the question is, if what you want to say is that Sunnism doesn't really do political philosophy or doesn't really do political theory, it does legal theory, it does theology.
Right.
That's an argument. I'm not
saying that necessarily. I'm just saying that Sunnism hasn't, at the moment, it's kind of formulating, political theories, and the Islamists that you're studying are articulating what is
Right.
the best effort, and that's why I'm grateful that you've written this book, because these are, in many respects, I think, the major attempts at trying to develop some kind of political theory. In my doctoral dissertation, I kind of said, I think, if I recall correctly, that it's not clear that it can be called political theory yet, but it's certainly some kind of political reflection and engagement and thought. It's political thought of some kind. I'm talking about Yusuf Qaradawi here, I think. And so I think that the modern sort of condition does force Muslims to try and develop that kind of political theory. But they can also resort to, okay, let's just live with the authoritarians in Abu Dhabi or in Riyadh or in Cairo. And I personally think, in all frankness, I think these are all options available to modern day Sunnism. I happen to have, sympathies towards, the more democratizing type. But I also recognize that democracy is not going to satisfy Western sort of observers, because it doesn't give the kind of popular sovereignty, even though it might use that term, but it's adapted that term in a sense that would not be recognized by a lot of Westerners.
So one of the things that I argue, I have a piece coming out soon, actually in Zaytuna's journal Renovatio.
Fantastic.
And one of the points I make is, well, you want to talk about democracy, so let's talk about a minimalist conception of democracy,
Right.
in which the rulers are limited, the rulers can be removed, there's checks and balances, there is some kind of rule of law, rulers are accountable. So that is a kind of minimalist conception of democracy.
Right.
Now, I think even a lot of the neo-traditionalists have to recognize that a lot of that minimal conception of democracy is compelling within a very, very conservative Sunni tradition, right? The ruler is not designated by God. The ruler can be removed. He has to fulfill certain conditions. He's bound by the law, so on and so forth. But then what I want to say is, fine, it's not me that's saying, oh, if you really want to be democratic, you have to fulfill, these conditions by Jürgen Habermas. I'm not saying that.
Right.
It's Islamist thinkers themselves. Now,
yes.
Ghannouchi is just, I chose to do a deep dive into one thinker, but he's kind of like standing in for many, many other thinkers. Turabi, Imara, Salim al-Awwa.
Right.
And I try to document a lot of this. I say, well, there's this whole tradition from the 1970s of post-Qutbian thinkers that want to take democracy seriously and not just an apologetic way.
Right.
And so they all have these attributes in common.
Right.
And Ghannouchi is kind of the apotheosis of this view. I could have chosen Turabi or others, but anyway. So it's not.
Turabi I think Turabi's also would have exactly the same kind of aporias that Ghanouchi suffers from as well. Yeah.
That's
so the most important theories.
It's not just that that Ghanouchi is both important because he's also a politician, so we pay attention to him.
Right.
But he's also a stand-in for a certain kind of tradition of thought that developed.
Yeah.
I want to say more about your other criticism of focusing on Ghanouchi since 2011, which I think is valid, but I have an answer to. So the point is, they are the ones saying, no, we can do better than that. We can do better than just minimalist democracy as the rulers are accountable.
Right.
We actually are committed deeply to a kind of democracy as a realization of a political theology. The Ummah is God's Caliph, and all kinds of things follow from that.
Right.
So I'm not saying that.
But if he, as soon as he brings that kind of religious language, people like who are the hardcore secularists that are constantly trying to sort of kicking him out of office will get a lot of cannon fodder, I think.
Okay,
I mean, we'll
so
get a lot of
about
you know.
this. You clearly want to talk about that issue. Let's talk about it.
Sure.
What happens in Tunisia after 2011? Now, you mentioned his book earlier, Democracy wa Huquq al-Islam, or something like that.
Yes.
Now, what's interesting about that book, published in 2012, and I think I quote that in my book, he's still talking in this very, very perfectionist vein, right? That the human being only thrives with religion. The purpose of the state is to perfect the human by fusing our innate interests with the
Right.
So what's interesting then is they return to Tunisia, they have democratic elections, and Nahda does very, very well. They're not trying to bring about an Islamic state. And eventually, they have this formal declaration that we no longer belong to political Islam. We adhere to something called Muslim democracy.
Now, when was that again? Do you remember exactly?
Was it 2016? Was it the party?
Okay,
Congress
I think so.
Okay.
Yeah.
But similar things have been going on like that for a long time.
Right.
Now, at least two things are going on that may or may not be in contradiction. One, you have an actual political party that wants to not be couped, not provoke a military, coup, not be thrown back in jail, not be rejected by the international community, not scare the rest of the parties. So there's all the pragmatic influences, right? Why do Republicans condemn Trump's insurrection? Not because they actually have a commitment to democracy, but because they feel that they have to. Okay.
Right.
So there's a kind of pragmatism in which you might say nothing that they say has any significance for how we ought to understand Islamic political theory.
Maybe not nothing.
Hold on. That's one possibility. Like what Ghanouchi says on a day-to-day basis as Speaker of Parliament.
Yeah, that's a different thing. Yeah.
Now, at the same time, they did try to say, how do we understand the Constitution from a religious standpoint? How do we understand these values of consensus, compromise, stability, agreement? And then, how do we relate that to this claim that there's this other theory of politics called Muslim democracy that is different from Islamism, different from political Islam, different from Islamic democracy? Now, I think there is a genuine thing going on. Now, this trope of Muslim democracy has been going on for a while, right? Turkey, Indonesia, right? Different kinds of Islamist thinkers and parties have tried to use this trope of Muslim democracy to signal, don't be scared of us, but also we no longer think that bringing about an Islamic state is going to be easy or it's going to be the solution to all of our problems. Okay? So that's one issue. Now, then the question is there any there to this idea of Muslim democracy? Should we take it seriously intellectually at all? As a post-sovereigntist, post-utopian theory of politics? If so, where should we go to look for it? What sources count?
Right.
And so my view would be some of Ghanouchi's writings are extremely important
Yeah.
for a roadmap to that, but
Yeah.
no, not what he says about the crisis with France a few months
Sure,
ago,
sure,
or
sure.
Tunisia and the IMF
Right.
or something like that.
Right. I mean, in a sense, and you also mentioned Hibaru of Izzat in your footnotes, and Jasir Auda, and these are interesting figures. I mean, Jasir Auda, I feel a little bad about this now, but I mean, I critiqued him a bit harshly in my dissertation. Partly because I felt because this is something which has been in his writing for a while. This kind of wholesale acceptance, in my estimation, of the nation state and giving it priority over sort of any semblance of Islamic legal discourses, and it's like I find that an interesting move, but it doesn't cohere terribly well with what he, I think, wants to do. But I think you're right in pointing out that people like Ghanouchi and people like, I haven't read Hibaru of Izzat's work, but people like Jasir Auda are blazing a new trail, in a sense, of post-sovereigntist political Islam, as you put it in your book, drawing, I think, on Dworkin. But I in a sense am doing iltimas al-udhr, to use an Arabic phrase, like I'm trying to make excuses for Ghanouchi for sort of foregoing or basically setting aside his past relatively sophisticated discourse that you deal with in chapter 6. I'm very conscious of your time, and this has been a wonderful conversation. So I don't want to sort of necessarily, and we've gone on for quite a while. So I hope listeners have found this very beneficial. But I think this is probably a good place as any for us to conclude the evening. And I want to really thank Andrew for taking so much time, so much of your time, and also we had a bit of technical difficulties. You were very patient with that, and I appreciate that. I really want to thank you for writing this book. It's really been, I think, as I put it in a forthcoming review, I think this is the most sophisticated, politically, philosophically sophisticated treatment of Islamism that's ever been written, really, in the English language. And so I think we're all grateful for that. And I've been speaking to the author, Andrew March, about his book, The Caliphate of Man, Popular Sovereignty in Modern Islamic Thought. And this has been Middle East Centre Book Talk. Thank you for listening, and goodbye from Oxford.
Thank you very much, and goodbye from Massachusetts.